trash like you! Men decide who belonged.
They threatened to foreclose and charge $3,000 in legal fees.
That camera comes down by sunset, or I'm having you arrested for harassment. Those words would echo through the Pinewood Estates community for months to come. Sandra Mitchell stormed across my freshly seeded lawn at 743A, and her designer heels sinking into the soft soil with each furious step, clutching her laminated HOA rulebook like it was a weapon. Another trashy newcomer thinking they can ignore our standards, she jabbed her finger toward my Ring doorbell camera, her face twisted with contempt that went far deeper than concern about neighborhood aesthetics. Her manicured hand shot out and slapped the notification envelope I was holding right out of my grip, legal documents scattering across my porch like leaves in a storm. Sandra grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, her acrylic nails digging into my skin. Trash like you doesn't belong in gated communities. She twisted my arm behind my back, her phone already out and recording what she clearly believed would be evidence of my non-compliance. Other neighbors gathered on their porches, some filming, others whispering behind cupped hands. My briefcase sat on the porch beside me, containing the very documents that would soon turn Sandra's world upside down. The brass nameplate on my mailbox read, Dr. Michael Torres, Esquire, but Sandra was too busy performing her authority to notice. Just 50 feet from my own property, being verbally assaulted by the woman who would soon learn exactly who she was dealing with. Have you ever witnessed instant karma delivered with such brutal precision? Inside the emergency HOA board meeting that Sandra called within 2 hours, she straightened her designer blazer and cleared her throat with practiced authority. She had orchestrated this performance dozens of times before with previous residents who dared challenge her rules. Control the narrative, establish dominance, make herself the righteous defender of community standards. The board always sided with her over newcomers, especially when those newcomers looked like me. Mr. Chairman, Sandra began, her voice dripping with rehearsed concern. I was conducting my routine morning property compliance inspection when I encountered a flagrant violation of our architectural standards. She gestured dramatically toward the projection screen showing photos of my house that she'd taken without permission. The resident at 2847 Oakmont Drive has installed unauthorized surveillance equipment that violates Section 12.4 of our community covenants regarding external modifications. The interim board chairman, Gerald Hutchins, a retired insurance executive in his late 60s, nodded approvingly from behind the conference table. And what exactly did you observe, Mrs. Mitchell? Well, sir, he was dressed inappropriately for someone living in our premium community, installing what appeared to be multiple surveillance cameras without proper architectural review approval. Sandra's eyes gleamed as she warmed to her fabrication. When I approached to explain our procedures, he became verbally aggressive, using profanity and making threats about lawsuits. From their seats at the board table, 2 other longtime residents, Patricia Dunn and Robert Chen, exchanged knowing glances. They had heard Sandra spin similar narratives countless times before. Different homeowners, same script. He kept screaming about being some kind of lawyer, Sandra continued, her voice laden with disdain. These people always claim to have connections, attorneys on speed dial. Anything to avoid following the same rules everyone else has to follow. I've seen this playbook before, mister. Chairman, Gerald leaned forward, clearly engaged in Sandra's performance. Did he attempt to interfere with your inspection duties? Absolutely. The resident became physically aggressive when I attempted to document his violations. He threatened me with legal action, claimed he would have me arrested. Sandra's hand trembled slightly as she spoke, the only crack in her polished performance. I was forced to defend myself and assert my authority as HOA compliance director to ensure community standards were maintained. The meeting stenographer's fingers flew across her laptop, capturing every fabrication for the permanent record. In the back row, a young attorney named Jennifer Park frowned, something nagging at her memory about the address Sandra kept mentioning. Mrs. Dunn, Sandra called out, Can you corroborate my observations about this resident's behavior pattern? Patricia Dunn stood, her pearls catching the fluorescent light. Yes, Sandra, I've witnessed multiple violations at that property. The resident clearly doesn't understand or respect our community standards. Mrs. Mitchell has handled this situation with her usual professionalism, and the alleged threats? Gerald inquired, his tone suggesting he'd already decided which side he believed. Sandra's jaw tightened with righteous indignation. Mr. Chairman, I used only the authority granted to me by this board to address violations that threaten our property values. Any distress this resident claims to have experienced resulted from his own refusal to comply with clearly established rules. She pulled out her phone, swiping to carefully edited video that conveniently started mid-conversation. I have partial footage here, though unfortunately some of the earlier interaction wasn't captured due to technical difficulties. The lie rolled off her tongue smoothly, practiced from years of similar performances. How convenient, someone murmured from the audience seating area, but the comment was too quiet for Sandra to identify the speaker. Sandra continued her presentation, clicking through a PowerPoint she'd prepared. What we're seeing here is a classic case of someone playing the victim card after being caught violating community standards. He moved into our premium neighborhood, ignored our architectural guidelines, and when confronted with his violations, he immediately claimed harassment and discrimination. The interim chairman nodded sympathetically. Mrs. Mitchell, in your 8 years as compliance director, have you encountered similar situations? Unfortunately, yes, Mr. Chairman. There's a pattern with certain residents who believe they're above the rules that everyone else follows. Sandra's voice rose with practiced indignation. They use accusations of overreach and bullying to deflect from their own noncompliance. It's honestly insulting to the residents who actually respect our community standards and follow proper procedures. Several people in the audience, mostly longtime homeowners who supported Sandra's strict enforcement, nodded in agreement. They had heard similar stories in neighborhood Facebook groups, seen similar conflicts play out in community forums. It felt familiar, almost comfortable. The resident claims he was following proper procedures. Sandra made air quotes mockingly, but he couldn't provide any architectural review, approval, any variance documentation, or any legitimate reason for installing surveillance equipment that clearly monitors neighboring properties without consent. Robert Chen, one of the more moderate board members, shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Mitchell, did you verify whether this property is actually subject to our architectural review requirements? Some of the older lots in that section have "I've verified everything thoroughly," Sandra interrupted sharply. This resident is absolutely subject to our covenants. His refusal to acknowledge HOA authority is simply another manipulation tactic. Jennifer Park, the attorney in the back row, was now frantically scrolling through her phone, pulling up property records for Oakmont Drive. Her expression shifted from curious to alarmed as she read the boundary descriptions. Furthermore, Sandra pressed on, sensing momentum. I want to emphasize the restraint I've shown. This resident was clearly hostile, possibly unstable, definitely uncooperative. A less experienced compliance director might have immediately filed for injunctive relief or demanded his removal from the community. I chose to bring this matter to the board first as a courtesy. Gerald nodded gravely. Your professionalism is noted, Mrs. Mitchell. This board appreciates your dedication to maintaining our community standards. In the audience, a man in his mid-40s sat quietly, making notes in a leather portfolio. His name was Michael Torres, and he was taking mental notes of every fabrication, every exaggeration, every detail that would soon unravel Sandra Mitchell's 8-year reign of terror over Pinewood Estates. Sandra had no idea she was presenting her case in front of the very person who had the power and the credentials to destroy not just her HOA position, but potentially her freedom. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Mrs. Mitchell? Gerald asked. Sandra straightened her shoulders with pride. Just that incidents like this remind us why we need strong community enforcement. Some people only understand authority when it's backed by consequences. This resident learned today that our rules apply to everyone, regardless of who they think they are. She had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The interim chairman smiled approvingly. The board acknowledges Mrs. Mitchell's comprehensive report. We'll be issuing formal violation notices and pursuing appropriate remedies, including potential fines and legal action if this resident continues his non-compliance. As Sandra gathered her presentation materials, she caught the eye of the quiet man in the back row who'd been taking notes. She smiled at him condescendingly, a gesture of complete dominance, total victory. It would be the last moment of triumph in her entire HOA career. The respondent may now present his statement, Gerald announced, his tone suggesting this would be a mere formality before the board voted to fine the non-compliant resident into submission. Michael Torres stood slowly from his seat in the back row, closing his leather portfolio with a quiet snap. Despite wearing casual clothes rather than his usual courtroom attire, he carried himself with an unmistakable authority that made several board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman." His voice was clear, controlled, and carried a professional weight that seemed to change the atmospheric pressure in the room. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these allegations." Gerald blinked. Something in Torres's tone was unexpected, authoritative in a way that didn't match the narrative Sandra had presented. "First, I want to clarify several factual inaccuracies in Mrs. Mitchell's presentation." Michael's eyes swept the room methodically, landing on each person who had supported Sandra's fabrications. According to her statement, "I was violating HOA architectural guidelines by installing surveillance equipment. However, I need to establish a critical jurisdictional fact." He opened his portfolio and pulled out a document. "This is my property deed, recorded with the county on October 15th, 2024. I'd like to draw your attention to a specific clause on page 3. The board members leaned forward, suddenly engaged despite themselves. The legal description clearly shows that 2847 Oakmont Drive sits outside the boundaries of Pinewood Estates Homeowner Association. Michael's words dropped into the room like stones into still water. "My property was subdivided from the original parcel before your HOA was established in 2015. It is not, has never been, and cannot be subject to your architectural review requirements." The stenographer's fingers paused mid-keystroke. Sandra's face went pale. Furthermore, Michael continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone completely comfortable presenting evidence. "Mrs. Mitchell testified that I became verbally aggressive and used profanity. I'd like to address that claim by stating for the record that I remained calm throughout her trespass onto my property this morning. Despite her physical assault on my person and destruction of my property," Gerald interrupted, confusion evident in his voice. "Physical assault? Mrs. Mitchell reported that you..." "What, Mrs.?" Mitchell reported. Michael's voice took on an edge of steel. "Was a fabrication designed to justify her 8-year pattern of harassment against residents she personally determines don't belong in this community." Jennifer Park was now standing in the back, her phone pressed to her ear, clearly making urgent calls. Now, regarding Mrs. Mitchell's claim that her video documentation suffered from technical difficulties, Michael reached into his portfolio and pulled out a tablet. "I should mention that I have complete unedited footage of this morning's incident from multiple angles. My Ring doorbell camera, my driveway camera, and my phone all captured Mrs. Mitchell's trespass, her assault, and most importantly, her exact words." He pressed play on the tablet and Sandra's voice filled the conference room. "Trash like you doesn't belong in gated communities." The recording was crystal clear, undeniable. Several board members visibly recoiled. "Your Honor," Gerald started to say, then caught himself. "I mean, Mr. Dr. Michael corrected quietly. "Dr. Michael Torres, though I also use Esquire when I'm practicing law, which is my primary profession." The silence that followed could have been cut with a knife. Dr. Torres, Gerald's voice, had lost all its earlier confidence. "You mentioned you're an attorney?" Not just an attorney, Mr. Chairman. I'm a civil rights attorney specializing in housing discrimination and HOA abuse cases. I've successfully prosecuted 47 HOA boards for violations of Fair Housing Act, constitutional rights violations, and abuse of authority. Sandra looked like she might faint. Over the past 15 years, Michael continued, walking toward the front of the room with the measured pace of someone who had done this many times before, I've recovered more than $30 million in damages for homeowners who were targeted, harassed, and discriminated against by HOA boards that exceeded their authority. He placed the tablet on the board table, the video still cued and ready. I've been living in this community for exactly 9 days. In those 9 days, I've documented 17 separate instances of Mrs. Mitchell trespassing on my property, 8 instances of her making discriminatory statements, and 3 instances of her destroying my property or interfering with my legal installations. Gerald was frantically flipping through papers, clearly trying to verify the property boundary claims Michael had made. But here's what makes this morning's incident particularly interesting, Michael said, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone. Mrs. Mitchell's behavior wasn't random harassment. It was part of a systematic pattern I've been investigating for the past 6 months as part of a federal lawsuit against this HOA and its leadership. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Federal lawsuit? Patricia Dunn's voice came out as a squeak. Yes, Mrs. Dunn. You see, I didn't just randomly choose to buy a house adjacent to Pinewood Estates. I specifically purchased this property as part of an investigation into complaints from 14 former residents who were harassed, fined, and in some cases forced to sell their homes by Mrs. Mitchell's discriminatory enforcement practices. Michael pulled out another folder, this one significantly thicker. This folder contains complaints filed with the Department of Housing and Urban Development spanning the past 8 years. Every single complaint names Sandra Mitchell as the primary aggressor. Every single complaint describes similar patterns of behavior to what she attempted with me this morning. Sandra's carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time. Mrs. Mitchell claimed I threatened her with legal action. Michael continued, that part is actually true. I did inform her that her behavior constituted trespass, assault, and violation of my civil rights. I did inform her that I would be pursuing legal remedies. What she failed to mention is that I also informed her of my professional credentials, showed her my bar association card, and explained exactly why her actions were illegal. He turned to face Sandra directly. She chose to ignore that information and proceed with her assault anyway. Probably because she's accustomed to residents who don't have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. Jennifer Park pushed her way to the front of the room. Mr. Chairman, I need to interrupt. I'm Jennifer Park, and I represent 3 former Pinewood Estates residents who were driven out by Mrs. Mitchell's harassment. I've been trying to get you to take their complaints seriously for 2 years. Gerald looked like he wanted the floor to open and swallow him whole. Dr. Torres, Jennifer continued, I believe we've been working parallel investigations. My clients will be thrilled to know you've documented recent evidence. Michael nodded. Miss Park, I'm familiar with your clients' cases. In fact, their complaints were part of what prompted my investigation. I have documentation that will support their claims comprehensively. He turned back to the board. Mr. Chairman, Mrs. Mitchell testified that I claimed to be some kind of lawyer as though I was fabricating credentials to avoid accountability. Let me be absolutely clear about my qualifications. Michael pulled out his bar association card, his state attorney license, and several other credentials, laying them on the table in front of the stunned board members. I graduated summa cum laude from Yale Law School, where I was editor of the Yale Law Journal. I've been admitted to practice before the Supreme Court of the United States. I currently serve as senior partner at Torres & Associates, specializing in civil rights litigation. Sandra had sunk into her chair. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. But most relevant to today's proceedings, Michael's voice filled the room with quiet authority. I've spent the past 6 months working with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the Department of Justice. and the Department of Housing and Urban Development investigating systematic discrimination and harassment in planned communities across this state. He pulled out one final document. This is a federal subpoena for all Pinewood Estates HOA records, including Mrs. Mitchell's enforcement files, board meeting minutes, and financial records showing how selective enforcement has been used to target specific residents. Gerald was now visibly sweating. Dr. Torres, I assure you that this board had no knowledge of any discriminatory practices. With respect, Mr. Chairman, ignorance is not a defense. When you've received written complaints for years and consistently sided with Mrs. Mitchell despite obvious patterns of abuse. Michael's tone was professional but firm. This board empowered her, ignored complaints about her, and created the environment that allowed her harassment to continue unchecked. He opened his tablet again. Now, let's watch the complete unedited footage of this morning's incident, shall we? I want everyone in this room to see exactly what your compliance director does when she thinks no one with power is watching. The video began to play. Every slap, every slur, every moment of Sandra's contemptuous abuse played out in high definition for the entire board and assembled residents to witness. By the time it finished, several people were crying. Others looked ready to be sick. Sandra sat frozen, unable to move or speak. Mrs. Mitchell spent this morning telling you that I played the victim card, Michael said quietly. But what you just witnessed is the reality of her enforcement. Not professional compliance monitoring, not concern for community standards, pure discriminatory harassment based on her personal judgment about who belongs in this community and who doesn't. He closed his tablet with a soft click. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be filing federal civil rights charges against Mrs. Mitchell personally and against this HOA board collectively. I'm also going to be seeking an injunction to remove her from any position of authority and to place this HOA under federal monitoring. The room sat in stunned silence. But before I do that, Michael continued, I want everyone here to understand something. What Sandra Mitchell did to me this morning isn't special or unique. It's what she's been doing to vulnerable residents for years. The only difference is that I had the knowledge, resources, and authority to fight back. Most of her victims didn't. He gathered his documents and prepared to leave. You'll be hearing from my office formally within 48 hours. I suggest this board consult with competent legal counsel immediately. As he walked toward the exit, Sandra finally found her voice. You can't do this. I was just enforcing community standards. I have authority. You have nothing, Michael interrupted, turning to face her one last time. No authority, no immunity, no protection. What you have, Mrs. Mitchell, is a federal civil rights investigation that's about to expose 8 years of discrimination, harassment, and abuse. He paused at the door. You told me this morning that trash like me doesn't belong in gated communities. Well, Mrs. Mitchell, let me tell you what trash really looks like. It looks like someone who uses a volunteer HOA position to terrorize neighbors based on how they look, what they drive, or whether they meet your personal standards of who deserves to live in a nice neighborhood. The door closed behind him, leaving Sandra Mitchell to face the consequences of a career built on prejudice and abuse of authority. The board meeting dissolved into chaos within minutes of Dr. Torres's departure. Gerald Hutchins tried to maintain order, but the assembled residents were having none of it. Voices overlapped, accusations flew, and several longtime homeowners began sharing their own stories of Sandra Mitchell's harassment that they'd previously been too intimidated to report. She fined us $500 for having the wrong shade of white paint on our shutters, one elderly woman said, her voice shaking. The color was approved in our architectural application, but she said it looked cream instead of pure white. We had to repaint our entire house. She threatened to foreclose on our property because our teenage son's car had a bumper sticker she found inappropriate, another resident added. We spent $3,000 in legal fees fighting her. The testimonies kept coming, each one painting a clearer picture of Sandra's 8-year reign of discriminatory enforcement. But Sandra barely heard any of it. She sat paralyzed in her chair, her mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. A federal civil rights attorney, 6 months of investigation, complete video documentation, federal subpoenas. Her phone buzzed with a text from her husband, Richard, who had been watching the live stream of the meeting. "What the hell is happening? You told me this was just another non-compliant resident. Call me now." Sandra's hands trembled as she tried to formulate a response, but before she could type anything, Gerald's voice cut through the chaos. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm placing you on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation into these allegations. Please surrender your HOA compliance credentials, your access cards to common areas, and any files or documentation you have related to enforcement actions." "You can't do this," Sandra said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I've been protecting this community for 8 years. I've maintained our property values, enforced our standards. You've been sued 16 times. Jennifer Park interrupted, pulling up records on her phone. "This HOA has paid out over $400,000 in settlements and legal fees related to your enforcement actions. 16 times, Mrs. Mitchell. And that's just the cases that actually made it to litigation. How many residents did you harass into compliance or drive out of the community entirely?" The number hung in the air like an accusation. "I want to present some additional context." Jennifer continued, addressing the board, "I represent the Martinez family, who were fined $50 per day for 8 months because Mrs. Mitchell deemed their culturally traditional front yard garden inappropriate for community aesthetics. I represent the Chen family, who were threatened with foreclosure because they hosted their extended family for holidays, and Mrs. Mitchell claimed their guests' cars violated parking ordinances. I represent the Johnson family, who sold their home at a loss after Mrs. Mitchell conducted compliance inspections 3 times a week, documenting imaginary violations. She pulled out a thick folder. Every single one of my clients is Latino, Asian, or Black. Want to guess the demographic breakdown of Mrs. Mitchell's enforcement actions over the past 8 years? Gerald's face went from pale to gray. We'll need to review. I've already done the analysis, Jennifer interrupted. 87% of Sandra Mitchell's enforcement actions targeted minority homeowners, despite minorities representing only 32% of this community's population. That's not just bias. That's systematic discrimination. Sandra finally stood, her designer blazer rumpled, and her earlier confidence completely shattered. This is a witch hunt. I've always treated everyone fairly, applied the rules equally. Then explain this. Jennifer pulled up a photo on her tablet. This is the Henderson property, owned by the former HOA president and his wife, both of whom are white. Notice the color of their shutters? That's not approved white, that's cream. The exact shade you fined the Nakamoto family $500 for using, but you never cited the Hendersons, did you? Sandra's mouth opened and closed without sound. Or this. Jennifer swiped to another photo. The Wilson property, also owned by white residents. Their teenage son's car has bumper stickers that explicitly violate your interpretation of the aesthetic standards section, but they've never received a citation. Meanwhile, the Rodriguez family's son had his college parking permit on his windshield, and you threatened them with fines. The pattern was undeniable, irrefutable, devastating. Mr. Chairman, Jennifer addressed Gerald directly, Dr. Torres mentioned he's been investigating for 6 months. What he didn't mention is that his investigation uncovered financial irregularities that suggest Mrs. Mitchell may have been profiting personally from some of her enforcement actions. The room went silent. What are you talking about? Gerald demanded. I'm talking about the fact that Mrs. Mitchell has been recommending specific contractors for remediation work, and those contractors have been paying her referral fees that were never disclosed to this board or the community. Jennifer pulled out bank records. Over $45,000 in payments over 3 years, all from contractors who mysteriously ended up getting hired by residents Mrs. Mitchell had cited for violations. Sandra's face went from pale to gray. Those were legitimate consulting fees for my expertise in architectural standards. Consulting fees that created a financial incentive for you to cite violations and recommend expensive remediation work, Jennifer countered. That's called a kickback scheme, Mrs. Mitchell. And it's illegal. The board members were frantically whispering among themselves, clearly realizing the legal liability they were facing. Furthermore, Jennifer continued, Dr. Torres has documented evidence that Mrs. Mitchell has been accessing homeowners' personal information without authorization, including financial records, credit reports, and background checks that she had no legal right to obtain. I needed that information to verify compliance with community standards. Sandra protested weakly. You needed it to target vulnerable residents who you thought couldn't fight back, Jennifer shot back. You pulled credit reports to identify homeowners facing financial difficulties, then you ramped up enforcement actions against them hoping they'd sell and leave. That's not compliance monitoring. That's predatory harassment. Gerald looked like he wanted to disappear. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to have to ask you to leave this meeting immediately. The board needs to consult with legal counsel about how to proceed. Sandra gathered her things with shaking hands, but before she could reach the door, Dr. Torres reappeared with two men in dark suits. Mrs. Mitchell, one of the men said, showing his credentials, I'm Special Agent Morrison with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. We need to ask you some questions about your enforcement activities and financial arrangements with local contractors. The room erupted in shocked gasps and frantic whispers. We've been investigating complaints about discriminatory housing practices in this community for several months. Agent Morrison continued, Dr. Torres has been assisting with that investigation as a subject matter expert on HOA abuse. We'd like you to come with us voluntarily, though we can obtain a warrant if necessary. Sandra's face crumbled. I want my lawyer. That's your right, Morrison acknowledged. But we're going to be interviewing every resident you've cited, every contractor you've worked with, and reviewing every financial transaction connected to your enforcement activities. We're also executing a search warrant for your HOA office and your home computer. As the agents escorted Sandra from the room, she caught sight of Dr. Torres watching from the doorway. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't show any satisfaction at her downfall. He simply nodded once, a gesture that conveyed a simple message. Justice has arrived. The door closed behind Sandra Mitchell, and she left her position, her reputation, and quite possibly her freedom in that conference room. 3 months later, the transformation of Pinewood Estates was nearly complete. The community center was packed once again, but this time the atmosphere was different. Instead of the tense, fearful energy that had characterized Sandra Mitchell's reign, there was a sense of hope and renewal. Dr. Michael Torres stood at a podium not as a defendant or a victim, but as the keynote speaker at a community forum on HOA reform that had drawn attendees from across the region. What happened here at Pinewood Estates isn't unique, he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Across America, homeowner associations wield enormous power over where people live, how they maintain their homes, and whether they can remain in their communities. When that power is misused, the consequences can be devastating. The audience, which included former Pinewood residents who had been driven out by Sandra's harassment, current residents who had suffered in silence, and HOA board members from neighboring communities, listened intently. Sandra Mitchell is currently facing federal civil rights charges, fraud charges, and identity theft charges, Torres continued. She's also named as a defendant in a class action lawsuit filed by 43 residents whose rights she violated. But Sandra Mitchell isn't the real problem. She's a symptom. He clicked to a slide showing statistics. The real problem is a system that gives individuals like her unchecked authority, no oversight, and immunity from consequences until someone with resources and knowledge fights back. Gerald Hutchins, who had resigned as interim chairman 2 weeks after the infamous board meeting, sat in the front row taking notes. He was now working with Torres on a comprehensive HOA reform initiative. Over the past 3 months, We've reviewed every enforcement action Sandra Mitchell took during her 8 years as compliance director, Torres said. We found that she cited 394 homeowners for violations. Of those, 312 were minorities. Of those 312 citations, we determined that 217 were completely baseless, citing non-existent violations or applying standards that didn't exist in the community covenants. The numbers were staggering, undeniable evidence of systematic discrimination. We also discovered that Sandra's enforcement actions generated over $800,000 in fines and assessment fees over 8 years. Much of that money was paid by residents who couldn't afford to fight back, who didn't know their rights, or who were too afraid of additional retaliation to challenge her authority. Torres clicked to another slide. But here's what gives me hope. Since Sandra's removal, this community has implemented comprehensive reforms that can serve as a model for HOAs across the country. He listed the changes: mandatory bias training for all board members, community oversight committees with rotating membership, transparent enforcement standards applied equally to all residents, prohibition on financial relationships between board members and contractors, and an appeals process for homeowners facing citations. Most importantly, Torres emphasized, Pinewood Estates has committed to reviewing every case from Sandra Mitchell's tenure and providing refunds and expungement of records for homeowners who were improperly cited. The audience applauded, many people wiping away tears. Jennifer Park took the podium next. I'm pleased to announce that all of my clients have reached settlement agreements with the Pinewood Estates HOA. The settlements include full refunds of improper fines, compensation for legal fees, and formal apologies from the board. Additionally, the HOA has established a victim compensation fund for any resident who was harmed by discriminatory enforcement. She paused, her voice growing emotional. But beyond the financial settlements, what matters most is that people who were driven from their homes, who were made to feel unwelcome in their own community, are finally being heard and validated. One of those people was Maria Rodriguez, who stood to share her story. My family lived in Pinewood Estates for 6 years. Sandra Mitchell made those 6 years a living hell. She cited us for everything imaginable, some real, most fabricated. She made comments about our family gatherings being too loud, our traditional decorations being inappropriate, our children's toys being eyesores. Maria's voice strengthened as she continued, We eventually sold our home at a significant loss just to escape the harassment. I thought we were alone, that something was wrong with us. Finding out that 43 other families experienced the same treatment, that's validation I didn't know I needed. The testimonies continued, each one adding another layer to the comprehensive picture of Sandra Mitchell's abuse of authority. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when the Nakamoto family, the elderly couple who had been fined $500 for cream-colored shutters, presented Dr. Torres with a gift. Dr. Torres, Mr. Nakamoto said, his voice thick with emotion. When Sandra Mitchell targeted our family, we felt helpless. We didn't have resources for lawyers, didn't understand our rights, didn't know where to turn. You could have just lived on your property outside the HOA and ignored what was happening to the rest of us. But you didn't. You fought not just for yourself, but for all of us. He handed Torres a framed photograph. It showed their house with its cream-colored shutters, which they had repainted after Sandra's citation, now restored to the original shade they preferred. This is our home the way we want it, the way it should have been all along. Thank you for giving us that freedom back. As the forum concluded and attendees mingled over refreshments, Torres found himself surrounded by HOA board members from other communities asking for guidance on implementing similar reforms. The key, he told them, is recognizing that HOA authority exists to serve residents, not control them. Every rule, every enforcement action should be about genuinely maintaining community standards, not about personal power or discriminatory targeting. Gerald Hutchins approached, looking older than he had 3 months earlier, but somehow more at peace. Dr. Torres, I owe you an apology. I enabled Sandra for years. I believed her reports, trusted her judgment, never questioned her motives. I'm ashamed of how many families suffered because of my failure to provide proper oversight. Torres shook his hand. Gerald, what matters now is that you're committed to reform. You're working to make things right. That's how we prevent future Sandra Mitchells from destroying more communities. As the evening wound down, Torres stood outside the community center, looking up at the Pinewood Estates entrance sign. It had been modified slightly with a new plaque beneath it reading, "A community built on respect, fairness, and inclusion." His phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer Park. Sandra's attorney just called. She's accepting a plea deal, 18 months federal prison, 5 years probation, permanent ban from serving on any HOA board, and full restitution to all victims. Justice is served. Torres allowed himself a small smile. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoration, reform, and ensuring that what happened to 43 families at Pinewood Estates would never happen again. 6 months after that transformative night, the ripple effects of Sandra Mitchell's downfall continued to reshape not just Pinewood Estates, but HOA governance across the entire state. Sandra Mitchell was serving her sentence at a minimum security federal facility where she spent her days in a prison job and her nights probably contemplating how a volunteer position had led to criminal conviction. Her HOA credentials, her authority, her reputation, all gone. The woman who had once terrorized an entire community now understood what it felt like to be powerless, but Sandra's conviction was just the beginning. The federal investigation she triggered uncovered corruption extending far beyond one community. 12 other HOA board members across the region faced charges for similar schemes. The state legislature passed comprehensive HOA reform legislation nicknamed the Pinewood Act that mandated oversight, transparency, and protections for homeowners' rights. Most importantly, the 394 families Sandra had cited during her 8 years of power were granted full review of their cases. 217 families received refunds, totaling over $400,000. Dozens more had their HOA records expunged of improper violations. The compensation fund Dr. Torres helped establish distributed an additional $1.2 million to victims who could demonstrate harm. Dr. Torres himself became a national advocate for HOA reform, invited to testify before state legislatures and consulting with homeowner rights organizations across the country. His story became a case study taught in law schools as an example of how systematic documentation and proper legal strategy could combat institutional discrimination. The community where it all happened had transformed entirely. The new HOA board, elected through a reformed process that ensured diverse representation, implemented policies that Sandra Mitchell would have found unthinkable. Cultural celebrations were encouraged. Architectural standards were revised to respect diverse aesthetic traditions. Enforcement actions required multiple board member approval and offered robust appeals processes. Jennifer Park's law practice expanded to focus exclusively on HOA victim representation. She now had a team of 5 attorneys, and they'd successfully litigated 47 cases using the precedents established in the Pinewood case. Her advocacy work had influenced HOA reform legislation in 7 states. Perhaps the most visible change was the memorial established in the Pinewood Estates Community Center. A wall of photographs showed all 43 families who had been driven out by Sandra's harassment, with a plaque reading, "To those who suffered in silence, your experiences matter. Your voices are heard. Your rights are protected." The young couple who bought Sandra Mitchell's former house, ironically a mixed-race family with young children, had no idea of the property's history when they moved in. They would later say that Pinewood Estates was the most welcoming, inclusive community they'd ever lived in, a testament to how completely the neighborhood had transformed. Today, Dr. Michael Torres still lives on his property at 2847 Oakmont Drive, just outside the Pinewood Estates HOA boundaries. His Ring doorbell camera still monitors his front porch, but now it mostly captures delivery drivers and friendly neighbors waving as they pass by. The recording that had exposed Sandra Mitchell's assault had been viewed over 30 million times online, becoming one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the history of HOA discrimination cases. On the anniversary of that confrontation, Torres was interviewed by a national news program about HOA abuse. The segment had reached millions of viewers, educating homeowners about their rights and warning HOA boards about the consequences of discriminatory enforcement. "The most common question I get," Torres told the interviewer, "is whether I planned all of this. Did I deliberately move next to Pinewood Estates to expose Sandra Mitchell? The answer is yes and no. I bought that property because I'd heard complaints about the HOA, and I wanted to investigate. But I never imagined Sandra would be so brazen, so confident in her impunity, that she'd assault me on my own property while being recorded." The interviewer asked, "What would you say to Sandra Mitchell if you could speak to her today?" Torres considered the question carefully. "I'd tell her that she had a choice every single day for 8 years. She chose to use her authority to hurt people rather than help them. She chose discrimination over fairness. She chose power over service. Those were her choices, and the consequences are hers to bear." He paused, then added, "But I'd also tell her that the system that enabled her is changing. The reforms we're implementing, the oversight we're establishing, the accountability we're demanding. That's the real justice. It's not just about punishing Sandra Mitchell. It's about making sure the next Sandra Mitchell never gets the chance to harm 43 families." The interviewer's final question: "Do you have any regrets about how this all unfolded?" "Only one," Torres replied. "I regret that I wasn't there sooner. I regret that it took me 6 months of investigation before I moved to that property. I regret that during those 6 months, Sandra Mitchell continued to harass residents who didn't have the resources to fight back. That's why the reform work is so important. We need systems that protect vulnerable homeowners before they need a civil rights attorney to save them." The broadcast ended with footage of the current Pinewood Estates community barbecue, an event that now happened monthly and drew residents from across the neighborhood. Families of all backgrounds gathered, children played, and the atmosphere was one of genuine community rather than enforced conformity. As the camera panned across the diverse, happy faces, the narrator concluded, "One woman's abuse of power led to criminal charges, federal investigation, and comprehensive reform. But more importantly, it led to 43 families getting justice, and thousands of homeowners across the country gaining protection from similar abuse." Sandra Mitchell wanted to decide who belonged in her community. Instead, she taught us all that everyone belongs, and no one has the right to make others feel unwelcome in their own homes. The final shot showed Dr. Torres standing in front of his house at 2847 Oakmont Drive, the property that had been the catalyst for everything. His Ring doorbell camera, visible in the frame, still recording, still protecting, still serving as a reminder that sometimes justice wears cameras instead of robes. Sometimes justice carries evidence instead of gavels. And sometimes, when you try to tell someone they don't belong, you discover that you're the one who doesn't understand what community really means. Never underestimate the power of standing up to HOA bullies who abuse their authority. Share this story if you believe everyone deserves to live in their homes without harassment or discrimination. Hit that like button if you want to see more stories of justice triumphing over corruption, and subscribe because stories like this happen every day, and everyone deserves to know their rights. Your HOA story could be next. Truth always finds a way.